Apologies, I'm not American, as you may or may not have guessed already, but I'm going to do my best. So let's hit the record and do this. Forward by Rebecca Rushdoony-Rouse. Reading my father's book, The American Indian, brought back a host of memories and the realization that my Pollyanna-like childhood memories were far from the reality of life at Ojai, Nevada. Perhaps because my father spent his youth among the... Perhaps because my father spent his youth among the Armenian minority in several communities and had faced discrimination, he could more easily identify with such groups as the Chinese he worked with in San Francisco during university days and the Shoshone and Paiute Indians of the Duck Valley and the Shoshone and Paiute Indians of the Duck Valley Indian Reservation, also known as the Western Shoshone Reservation. As he did with everything, he read as much as he could about the Indians to educate himself on their history and culture and how best to help and teach while he was serving there. As with many subjects he studied. As with many subjects he studied, he found that much of what experts wrote differed from what the Indians on the reservation had to say. Although this book is about his experiences over half a century ago, many of the myths and issues he confronted are still with us today. Ojai is on the remote northern border of Nevada, about 100 miles from Mountain Home. Chill pill. Ojai is on the remote northern border of Nevada, about 100 miles from Mountain Home, Idaho, and a similar distance from Elko to the south. Ojai is nestled in barren. Ojai is nestled in barren, rolling hills. There was deep snow in winter, which sometimes required my father to use snowshoes and the upstairs window to get out of the house. In summer, there were swarms of mosquitoes, and nets had to be draped over the long clotheslines so we children could play outside. The late springs after the snow melted were beautiful. Skies were a clear blue. Skies were a clear blue, and cattle and an occasional mountain lion could be seen roaming along the amber or green hilltops across the road from the manse. The manse sat between the mission and the school building and was at one end. And was at one end of the main road, which ran along a ditch. On the other side of the road were a gas and grocery store, a drugstore, and the Ojai Hospital. There were a few other businesses or buildings along the main road. Life was not easy on the reservation. Poverty was a constant problem, and it was far removed from the typical American community of its time. My father received his BA degree, English, in 1938 and his MA, Education, in 1940. Both from the University of California at Berkeley. In 1944, he finished his Master of Divinity at Pacific School of Religion, also in Berkeley, and was ordained by the Presbyterian Church USA. That same year, he moved to the Western Shoshone Mission at Ojai, the only town, if it could be called that, on the Duck Valley Reservation, where he remained until early 1953. This was a time of both change and growth for my father. Far removed from the University of Berkeley and the modernist seminary he attended, it was during his time. It was during his time in Auchi that his conviction. It was during his time in Auchi that his conviction developed that the whole Bible and biblical law were the foundation of the Christian faith, and that the Bible held the answer for every area of life. This came both from observing the disparity between those with and without faith in a broken culture, as well as his studies. While working on the reservation, he read voraciously and was introduced to the works of Cornelius Van Til, which had had a major impact on the rest of his life, his writings, and the refining and growth of his faith. My father kept a series of work journals that listed briefly the day's events and what he accomplished on a given day. His days were full, often lasting well into the night. The number of tasks he accomplished, the frequent trips to Elko and Mountain City on bad roads, the number of people he helped, visited, or transported to various destinations, the volume of letters he wrote, and the large number of funerals he presided over stand out in his journal. Each day's notation included the books he read, often multiple books in a single day, both fiction. Both fiction and non-fiction, and by a wide variety of authors. Snowtorms, everybody, let's go. It's snowtorm time. All the people are snowtorms. You like snowtorms? Me too. Snowstorms, which often left my father housebound, could result in a lengthy list of volumes read, and still it would come after a long list of chores and time spent with us children. And still it would come after a long list of chores and time spent with us children in the confines of the old manse. My father's work at the mission entailed much more than pastoring the church itself. It included working with the local school board, attending school board meetings, and actually processing the school bills, including payroll. It meant organising community events, visiting local households, dealing with the often frustrating Bureau of Indian Affairs agents, and getting bids for, as well as overseeing and working on, mission building projects. He frequently interceded for those who had gone afoul of the law, which usually meant a trip into Elko, and was involved in search parties for those who went astray in snowstorms. He raised animals for our meat, a goat for milk, chickens, and a garden for fresh produce or fruit. He took church boys out to help cut wood for those who needed it, and also on camping and fishing trips. More than once I remember my father delivering wood for heating and donating venison for those in need of food. He often took multiple trips in a week to Elko, Mountain City, Rio Tinto, a nearby copper mining town where I was born, and even to Boise, Idaho. Mission barrels came several times a year, containing clothing which he distributed to needy families. Some of the barrels came full of toys that were distributed at the annual Christmas program held next door at the school. My father's journals show that he had many speaking engagements added to his workload. That's not quite right, is it? My father's journals show that he had many speaking engagements added to his workload. Between the 5th and 14th of November 1947, for instance, he travelled through snow to speak at 16 different meetings in Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, and then conducted Sunday services the morning after his return to Auchi, yet he still managed to read 9 books. To this schedule he added raising his own brood of children, 5 by the time he left the reservation. Even his occasional fishing trips had the dual purpose of stocking the pantry. The fish were salted and added to the dried venison stored for use throughout the year. Time was not something my father wasted. My memories of Auchi are centered. My memories of Auchi. My memories of Auchi are centered around my father and mission life. They are of a childhood among caring neighbours, constant visitors, and the warmth and generosity expressed by so many of the Indian families, including the Premo, Thomas, and Manning families who worked alongside my father. They included Jenny Auchi, who was well over 100 years old and remembered her tribe being marched to the reservation, and her daughters, Judy Jack, who married a much younger man who was very ill so that she could care for him. Judy Jack often sat under the tree in front of our yard, smoking a pipe and telling us Shoshone stories about wolves, coyotes, and mountain lions. Josephine Crum came frequently to help out in the manse. There were 2 Indian boys, Monty and Chris, who lived across the road and up the hill, and who were daily playmates. Church picnics on old army blankets in the churchyard of the manse lawn, and Indian families who came to the mission in a buckboard or in winter by sleigh. My memories include the deep concern and love my father had for the members of the mission and the people who lived in Auchi. Raised a farm boy, his attitude was down to earth and practical. My father's mission and the goal of his work in Auchi was very much the same as his latter work at Chalcedon and the message of his numerous books. It was and continues to be the changing of lives, of communities, and our world by transforming hearts through Jesus Christ and His law word. Ordinarily, my father's works. Ordinarily, my father's works have been published as he wrote them, so as not to misconstrue any of his thoughts. This work, however, obviously represented a rough manuscript. Necessary editing was done by Lee Duigon and David Toulis, with all changes approved by my brother Mark Rushdoony. The chapters were written over a period of several years, ending in the 1990s. As a result, a few examples were As a result, a few examples and stories were repeated. Some of these could be edited for length or deleted without any loss of meaning. One chapter was so truncated. One chapter was so truncated it was deleted as a chapter, but its remaining content was easily merged into other chapters, so my father's narratives could be faithfully preserved. Extreme care was taken not to alter the intent of the author. Okie dokie. Well, I think we're going to stop that, and then I'll see you in the introduction very soon. Hello, this is Nathan. Thanks for joining me in the booth. I really hope you're enjoying the live streams and videos. To find out more about this narration project, or to make a donation, go to nathanteacher.com. Thanks. Okay, introduction. Editor's note. What follows is a transcription of a recorded talk given by the author in Santa Cruz, California. It is believed to date from either the late 1950s or early 1960s. It therefore predates the writing of the chapters in this volume, but was included as a valuable overview of the author's later written observations. It was edited for length and conformation to standards of written form. In addition, 3 paragraphs from a deleted chapter which further described the ghost dance were included. Mark R. Rushdoony. The American Indian is one of the most neglected persons in the world as far as missionary effort is concerned, but he is one of the most important in terms of the missionary challenge to the church. The American Indian is a standing indictment against the Christianity of this nation. Our Great Commission commands us to carry the gospel to all peoples. If we have so signally failed among the American Indians that in the last 60 years, instead of winning more Indians to Christ, we have only half as many Christians as we had in 1890, it means that our witness and our example are very sorry ones. It is, in a sense, much easier to convert people to Christ who are halfway around the world from us because they see only our representatives, our missionaries, and do not see us. But the American Indian tragically sees not only the missionary, but American Christianity itself, and his reaction to American Christianity is most negative. Who is the American Indian, and what is he like today? Some of you have perhaps seen him as you took a trip across the United States. As you stopped at some western railroad town near an Indian reservation, you no doubt saw some Indians lounging around the railroad station or near the local hotel and bars. In many instances, they may have seemed to be no more than a group of winos. In many instances, they may have seemed to be no more than a group of winos. If such was your impression, you were probably right. A large percentage of them are alcoholics. Then, if you have been on an Indian reservation and seen how they live, you have probably been quite upset by the things you saw. It is not unusual to find them living in the most abject circumstances under which disease thrives, TB and venereal diseases in particular. I've seen Indians live, 10 or 14 of them together in a little log cabin with a dirt floor that is perhaps no bigger than 8 or 10 feet by 12 feet. You can easily imagine how miserable it is to live under such conditions. Perhaps they have just one bed and nothing but bedrolls for the rest of the family. People who see these things very often say that the government ought to do something for the Indians. The answer to that is that the government has already done too much, far too much, and that we, the Christians of America, have done far too little. To understand how all of this came to be, let's look at the history of the American Indian. It would be easy to paint a tragic story of the mistreatment of the American Indian, and it would be easy to do so with historical data. It would be very easy to go back into our Presbyterian Historical Society's records and find stories of how Indians were deliberately inoculated with smallpox, which killed them because they had no resistance to it, or were deliberately and systematically debauched so that they might be eliminated and then their land taken over by the white man. But I think such stories would paint an unfair picture. I think a much more honest and realistic picture has been given by one of the old Indians of the Iowa Reservation in Nevada, where I served for 8.5 years, 1944 to 1953. He said, quote, "We hear a lot of the people on the outside making a great to-do about the mistreatment of the Indians, and a lot of our own people are ready to tell such stories. But when you look at it honestly, but when you look at it honestly, this is the story. The white man wanted what we had, our land, but he didn't want us. We wanted what the white man had, his improvements, his guns, his modern conveniences, but we didn't want him, and so we fought, each wanting what the other had, but not wanting the other, and trying to eliminate him, and we lost. That's the story. Now, that's a candid, realistic Indian account of the situation. Of course, it neglects one factor, that the white man in this situation was ostensibly a Christian. The conflict was a long, hard and bitter one. The Indian fought from the beginning, and because he fought so strenuously for his freedom, there were many who said that the only thing that would be done with the Indian was to exterminate him, wipe him out. They could not subject him to slavery. Very early on, the Spaniards had tried, but it was impossible to enslave the North American Indian. He absolutely refused. If Indians were taken captive and enslaved, they either died or they fought and escaped. To this very day, the Indians have a strong prejudice against Negros. They say, quote, "The Negro became a slave. You can't say much for people. You can't say much for people. You can't say much for people who become slaves. You either die or you fight for freedom. We fought for freedom, and we were beaten, but we were never made slaves." End quote. Of course, that was a reason for the long, bitter struggle. The Indian refused to give up. Outnumbered tremendously, he fought against the white man who had superior equipment, and time and again defeated him. By and large, the only way the Indians could be beaten was by superior equipment and overwhelming numbers. The greatest military strategist the North American continent has ever produced was Chief Joseph of the The greatest military strategist the North American continent has ever produced was Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce Indians. Chief Joseph's maneuvers in the Indian Wars are a classic of military brilliance. He took a handful of warriors, a tremendous number of women, both young and old, children and all the paraphernalia, of an Indian camp, and defeated the US Army again and again. It was not until he was near the Canadian border and believed he and his people were safe, perhaps even across the border, that the US Army under General Oliver O. Howard overtook him while he was completely unprepared for an attack and decimated his band. Indians are still close to these events. I have talked to old Indians, some of them now Presbyterian elders, who were young boys, aged 9 to 11 at the time of Chief Joseph's War, who saw the American cavalry tear into the Indian camp and wipe out a sizable portion of the people. The Battle of Wounded Knee, which ended the Sioux uprising under the medicine man, Sitting Bull, took place only in 1890. It was in 1911 that the last, quote, Indian trouble, end quote, in Nevada, led by Shoshone Mike with his band of Shoshone Indians, was finally put down with the extermination of his group. That's very recent history. Although some of the bitterest fighting was waged in the last half of the 19th century, it was the fighting of desperation. After 1869, the Indian knew he was defeated. Many of the Indian uprisings came later, but in 1869, the Indian knew his day was finished. What happened in 1869? In that year, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. In Utah, the dignitaries gathered together for that great occasion when the last spike was driven and the first train spanned the continent. The Indians who watched from the mountains saw that great iron monster hurtling across the plains, over the mountains and through the canyons, and knew that for them the end had come. As long as the white man marched across the continent on horseback, in covered wagons, or as isolated stragglers, he could be met and defeated. But when he crossed the country in his great iron monster, that was something final, transcending anything the Indian knew, something that declared the white man was here to stay. Hang on a second, there's a bit of beeping there in the background. Something that declared the white man was here to stay. Not only was he here to stay, but he was binding the continent to himself with ties of iron. A very significant movement in the history of the American Indian, one born of this defeat and pessimism, also began in 1869, the Ghost Dance. The Ghost Dance began in Nevada. From Nevada it sped throughout the western states, eastward across the Mississippi and into Canada, and to a certain extent into Mexico. The old Indians dreamed dreams, and the young men saw visions as the Ghost Dance prophets went from tribe to tribe carrying the news. They told stories of how God's Son came into the world and the white man killed him, and they said that God's Son told the people he would come back again. Quote, "He's going to come back. We've seen visions. He's going to come back, and he's going to take all the white men and punish them for their wickedness, and a great wind is going to sweep the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and is going to pick up all the white men and deposit them in the Pacific Ocean. After they have been swept off the continent, the buffalo and the antelope and the elk will come back again. The grass will be knee-deep on the 1,000 hills of America, and the Indian will live as he once lived. The dead will come back from their graves and rejoin the Indians of today, and there will be a glorious life." End quote. Other accounts of the Ghost Dance movement confuse Montezuma and Jesus. Montezuma, the great Indian emperor in Mexico, and Jesus Christ were both slain by the white men. Having heard vague stories about both, some Indians merged the two figures. And so they danced the Ghost Dance, believing that when they fulfilled all the conditions and the spirits were pleased, the great hour would come. They danced, but in pessimism gave it up. But then fresh prophets would come from Nevada, carrying the news of certain conditions they had newly dreamed about, and saying that if the people only met these conditions, deliverance would come. This time it would come for sure. So again they would... So again they would dance, night after night, day after day, until they dropped from exhaustion. And again the pessimism and the cynicism would set in. Several anthropologists wrote about the Ghost Dance and its believers. These studies are accurate, and yet very faulty, because scholars did not talk to the Indian dissenters. I met a few Sioux Indians who told me that Sitting Bull was not a chief, and that he was a coward. Indians connected with the US Army shot him because they hated him, and they resented the fact that he had led so many Sioux into the Ghost Dance cult. There was no such killing among the Paiutes and Shoshones, but there was a great deal of jeering and mockery directed at the dancers. Even in my day, Even in my day, a few older people were sometimes put down by being reminded that they had been ghost dancers. The Indian is too often identified with a variety of practices and events which interest anthropologists. The ghost dance did and does interest them, and rightfully so. And rightfully so. Does interest him, and rightfully so. Certainly, I was very much interested in it. interested in it? Certainly I was. Certainly I was very much interested in it. But I soon realized that this was one reason why most Indians quietly disliked the various scholars who studied their culture. The scholars studied the ghost dance people, but not their Indian critics. The ghost dance continued, sweeping through the West, rising and subsiding until the last flicker of it passed away in 1932 with the death in Nevada of Jack Wilson, the leader or prophet of the ghost dance movement. With that came a deep hopelessness, utter defeat, abject pessimism, and also the rise of peyotism, a religious narcotic cult. Peyote is worshipped. It is called, quote, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, end quote, in some groups. In others, it is given pagan names, and in others, a mixture of Christian and pagan terminology. Practitioners worship that narcotic. It is protected by the Indian Service, Bureau of Indian Affairs, and legalized by the United States because it is used, they say, by a religious group. They worship it, and it dulls their intelligence, destroys their moral fibre, and increasingly has laid waste the Indian peoples of America. The deaths which can be attributed to peyote are beyond description. There are no statistics because there are no statistics. Drink of water. There are no statistics because government doctors are afraid to attribute any death to peyote since the government protects it. Actually, the number of deaths is enormous, while the moral decadence, degeneration and degradation that accompany the use of peyote is extensive. Some of the old Indians tried to make a stand against peyote. When I first went to a reservation, I recall vividly an incident at a funeral service. About an hour before I was to conduct the service, the funeral feast was still going on, with perhaps 100 people gathered to partake of it, and we were standing around the campfire outside the cabin as the food was being served. An old Shoshone began to speak to the young men, many of whom were adherents of the peyote cult, saying, "Let us go back to the old ways, the good old ways. Worship the wolf. He is a true God. Don't pay it." Hang on a second. What did they do there? Oh, what is this? Don't pay any attention to the white man and his religion. They don't believe in it. Look at the government people. Look at the white men you see when you go to town and see how many of them believe in Christianity. Leave the new ways and go back to the old ways. Worship the wolf. It was futile. The old Indian ways were dead. They had little appeal. And the kind of religion that you and I try to give them also had very little appeal. As far as they were concerned, both were dead, the wolf and the religion of Jesus Christ. What had happened to the Indians? What had happened to the Indians? What had happened to the Indians? Sorry, just the camera went there. All right, how you doing? What's happening? Keeping it real, I hope. For real. Keeping it real. With my homies off the reservation. What had happened to the Indians? Let's look back. I forgot the camera. Oopsie daisies. Let's look back, first of all, to the old Indian character. Today, the Indian is a defeated man, a man lacking in character, an alcoholic, sexually very unstable and highly immoral. But the Indian of 100 years ago, the Indian of 200 or 300 years ago, was a very different person. The Plains Indian, for example, who inhabited most of the West except for the southwest and some of the coast, could be characterized by the term so common in this country in the 1920s and early 1930s, rugged individualist. This was the life of the Plains Indian. His entire training was geared for the single purpose of preparing him to meet life and survive. To be a man was to be someone capable of withstanding all kinds of suffering, surviving under the most adverse circumstances, standing up to almost any condition and meeting it alone or as part of a group. The children were trained, usually by their grandparents, by stories told around the campfire. The grandparents would tell their children, "Listen to me, because you are going to live by these stories." They would tell them stories of hunting and fishing and battle and survival. So small children would often survive under the most extraordinary circumstances. Circumstances, for instance, like this. An Indian camp was attacked. The parents immediately engaged in battle, the women taking cover with some of the family's useful possessions or else being seized or taken. What would happen to the children? The children knew instinctively what to do. Perhaps there was a badger hole nearby. They'd crawl into that hole, put leaves and rubble over the top of it, and stay there until darkness fell. Not until it was dark, when they could hear no noise or activity in the area, did they come out. I remember one such story of a boy of less than school age, in terms of our children, who crawled into a place of refuge and stayed there all day after his band was attacked. Oh, drink a link. When he came out at night, his band had been wiped out and his father was barely alive. "Son," the father said, "we'll try to go a little ways." They did try, but then had to rest because the man was obviously failing. They did try, but they had to rest because the man was obviously failing. As they lay down to rest, the father said, "Son, after a while, when you wake up, feel me. If I'm cold, don't cry, don't stay by me, don't bother with me, keep moving. When you hear sounds of an Indian camp, don't go into it. Go to the side from which the wind is blowing, lest the dogs smell you and come after you, and there wait until it's dark. Then creep close and listen, and if you hear our language being spoken, then go into the camp, but if not, keep moving." That boy, in early winter when the nights were down to 0, and sometimes lower, kept moving for more than 2 weeks until he found a band of his own people and joined it. How many of our children could survive under those circumstances? They would have been dead within a day. But that Indian child survived. Thus were the Indian children reared and trained. To be a man among the Sioux, you had to dance the sun dance. To dance the sun dance meant you had to be... To dance the sun dance meant you had to subject yourself to a tremendous ritual of torture. You could not marry or be a warrior unless you danced the sun dance. There was a pole, like a maypole, with leather thongs hanging from it. The candidates for manhood came near, and the warriors pried up the muscles of the youths' backs, slipped the thongs under them, and cinched the thongs up tight so that the young men would be on their toes for 3 days and 3 nights. They were to dance around the pole without wincing once, singing happy songs about the privilege of manhood. If one collapsed, which meant he'd be ripped open the muscles on his back, he would have to wait until the next year before he could apply again for manhood. It was a fearful ordeal, but every Sioux Indian in the old days danced the sun dance before he was a man. There are similar stories among the Shoshones. One of the things that I was interested in when I first went to the reservation was to hear stories of scalping from a member of my own session. I don't think there are many Presbyterian ministers in the United States who had a member of a session tell them about scalping and demonstrate the art without the realistic items, but enough to give a good description of the technique of scalping. "We Shoshones," he said, "were very humane in our scalping. We didn't always kill the person. We scalped him because if we were too angry with him, we turned him loose." End quote. He told me of a blacksmith up in the Bruno River country who was one of the last white men to be scalped and was always grateful and friendly to the Indians afterwards. He had expected to be killed, but since he lost nothing more than his scalp, he was quite congenial afterward, and the Indians frequently visited him, and the Indians frequently visited him in later years. The technique, as he described it, is significant. Among young Shoshones, if 2 men were competing for the chieftainship and they wanted to bet one against the other on who was the better runner, better hunter, or better shot with a bow and arrow, they would bet their scalps. The loser of the contest would have to let the winner scalp him. In so doing, he could demonstrate his own manhood and actually win a victory in the whole situation if he could keep the girls in stitches. If he could keep the girls in stitches while being scalped, he would sit on a rock and the other man would take a tight thong and tie it around his head, run a short knife around it, put his kneecap down on it, and yank and lift the whole thing. Of course, no hair or skin would ever grow there again. If, while this was being done, instead of wincing or crying, the young man could keep the watching girls amused, then he emerged the winner by demonstrating his ability to be a man. This capacity to take punishment and endure suffering is trained into the young Indian from early childhood. As a result, Indians to this day are much quieter people than whites, their children much quieter under any and every circumstance than white children. It's very rare for an Indian woman to express any pain or to cry out in childbirth or no matter how difficult the labour. Indeed, it's very rare to hear from Indeed, it's very rare to hear from any Indian in a serious accident an acknowledgement of pain. A classic instance of that involved a couple of young men whom we used to have occasionally in our church. One of them, Roy, was an especially good friend of mine. Roy and the other young man, Hooper, used to fight whenever they met, and Roy usually took a beating. Every Saturday nights, when they got drunk, something would draw the two of them together for a terrific fight. And when I say fight, it was a tough affair. In one of the last fights they had, Roy was so badly beaten that his jaw had to be wired, and it took several months to heal. So, when he was up and around again, he pretended to be drunk he pretended he was drunk. He pretended he was drunk one Saturday night and went to the mining camp. When Hooper jumped him, Roy was ready for it and worked him over quite thoroughly with a knife. Doctor, it's so funny. It's awful. It's awful. What a kiss. Dr. Hyde, who was our doctor at the time and was staying at a mining camp, told me how Hooper walked 2 miles from the scene of the knifing with a couple of friends and said on arrival, "Hey Doc, can you sew me up?" He was carrying his intestines in his hands. A single perforation in the intestines almost... What a guy. Hang on. A single perforation in the intestines is almost invariably fatal, Dr. Hyde told me. In this case, there were 2. More than that, Hooper required more than 950 stitches before being driven 16 miles to the Reservation Indian Hospital, where his patching up could be concluded. During the entire time, Dr. Hyde told me, there was not a whine or a whimper from the man. In a month, Hooper was up and about, and drunk again. You can see that the old Indian character was a rugged one. They were trained to meet life and survive. They were hard, disciplined warriors. Their character was, of course, savage, but it had integrity. They were honest men, trustworthy and self-reliant. But they were in the way. What does that mean? But they were in the way. When the Indian was defeated, the white men didn't want any part of him. People didn't want Indians roaming across the new ranches, farms, towns and cities, hunting in their old ways. So the federal government set up the reservation system, wherein the Indians were given a piece of land upon which they were ordered to stay. The Indian was not used to farming. In fact, for him, farming was women's work. Even chiefs who were partial to farming and tried to lead their people into the new way of life, when they were about to be caught with a shovel or farm implements in hand, they hid it immediately. They were ashamed. It was like a man being caught wearing an apron. Farming was women's work. Hunting, fishing and fighting were a man's work. By and large, in those days, the governments didn't try to teach Indians anything. For many years, the system was simply this. For many years. For many years, the system was simply this. Put the Indians on a reservation, tell them that if they leave, the army will go after them, and while they are on the reservation, tell them to report to the government office every Saturday or every other Saturday for a ration of goods, clothing, and necessities of life. Of course, that meant that the Indian didn't have to work. He had his living handed to him. After a few years of government handouts, the Indian character was completely destroyed. Take any 100 people from any city in the United States, place them on a reservation and tell them, now, you don't have to work for the next 20, 30 or 40 or 50 years. All you have to do is report to the government's agent and receive your rations, and that's all. What? Let me just pause this a second. Well done for listening right to the end. If you would like to know more about this important Christian audiobook project, please go to nathanteacher.com. Thanks.